I am very pleased to be moderating this panel. I'm going to talk a little bit about the project. I think we're going to show a little bit of the project, and then we're going to have a conversation about how this really monumental thing came together. So BBC Earth, Life in VR, California Coast is a real-time natural history documentary set off in the coast of California and made for Google Daydream and the Lenovo Solo Mirage. It's a first of its kind and exemplary in terms of partnership and craft. Since its launch in February, it's received universal praise from audiences and critics alike, and most recently winning the best VR AR experience at the Google Awards last month. Congratulations, it's amazing.
Thank you.
Today we're joined by the key people behind the project to unpick its inception and vision and to discuss the future potential of VR in factual storytelling and beyond. But before I introduce the panelists, let's have a look at this incredible project on the screen.
There's a complex web of life beneath these ocean waves. And so much more to discover if you just dive in. Here, ocean giants and microscopic marvels live side by side. All we have to do is find them. Life in VR, California Coast.
Just beautiful. Is it over?
Okay. It's over.
Wow, I mean, that really is just gorgeous. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
So let me introduce our panelists, and maybe you guys can say a few words about yourself as we go through. Bradley, want to start? Bradley Cooks,
Sure.
who is head of digital and entertainment games at BBC Studios.
Thank you. Yeah. So I look after the games and digital entertainment team, BBC Studio. So we do a lot of kind of taking BBC IP like Doctor Who and Top Gear and putting those into sort of games or digital experiences. But for us, we'd actually always kind of struggled to find a home for one of our sort of premier brands, which was BBC Earth and the different sort of natural science that goes with that. And so this was a great opportunity to kind of like do something really exciting with that.
So you work across VR, AR, and also games?
Yes, so we produce sort of games on kind of mobile, on console, PC, but this was one of our kind of first sort of forays into VR.
All right, exciting. So Phil Stewart, you obviously work with outside studios, right?
We do, yeah,
So
absolutely.
why don't you talk a little bit about Preloaded?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Phil Stewart. I'm the creative director and founder of Preloaded. And we are a game studio. We really focus on creating games and immersive content that has purpose. So really looking at how we can deliver experiences that have some sort of transformational intent baked into them. So we work with a range of different organizations, BBC one of them. We do a lot of work in the arts and culture space as well, publishers and brands. And this is a project that is something that was a really nice expression of kind of, I guess, what we do well, really focusing on putting content and authenticity into experiences. So, yeah.
So you've been part of the Games for Change community for a while.
Yeah, for sure. It's so nice to be here.
Yeah. What were some of the earlier games, projects that our community might know about, the things we're doing earlier?
Yeah, so I mean, the studio's been going for 18 years. I think the piece of work we had here 6 years ago was The End. So that was a game that was created to help people deal with the advent of death in their life if they don't have religion, and it was using kind of philosophy as a way in. So we made that with Channel 4 Education, that was one of the big ones.
That's great to have you back.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
And Kelly, you're also a familiar face to many people here in the games world, and it's awesome that you're working in VR and AR now.
Yeah.
Can you tell a little bit about yourself, and a little bit of your journey too, about how you got to.
Sure. Yeah, it's so great to be here in this context. Certainly, my background is I co-founded that game company with Genova Chen, doing Flow, Flower, and Journey for PlayStation. Then joined Ouya, the kickstarted Android console, in content acquisition, strategy, and developer relations. and came over to Google through the Play Games team, and then joined the Daydream team, which covers now VR, AR, and Lens, in working with external partners, bringing content to those platforms.
Well, that's great. Well, it's great to have you back too. And then,
Yeah.
then the Indie Fund.
And I'm a co-founder and partner in the angel investment fund, Indie Fund, which invests in smaller independent developers, helping them bring their content to life in a amenable and more pleasant way, hopefully.
So it's great to have you here on the panel in this context. I think it's so much also where Games for Change is heading, and with our whole XR for Change initiative too, in that there's great crossover between the games industry, the VR, AR industry, and also making just content, right?
Yeah.
For positive good. And
Absolutely.
I think this project exemplifies that. And when I think about the scope and the complexity of this kind of project, it's interesting just to hear how did it originate? How did it start? Did it start with BBC Earth? Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we've been thinking for a while that we'd like to do something in VR. I mean, sort of, one of the things that BBC Earth is very well known for through our kind of landmark series is kind of pushing the boundaries of kind of like technology and the way that we sort of deliver kind of like the entertainment and the science at the same time in our TV series. And it just felt like, VR would offer a great opportunity to take that storytelling and approach it in a different way. And actually, when the kind of opportunity came up with Daydream, which, for us was, one of the first sort of mobile kind of VR platforms that was going to allow us to do really what we wanted, do justice to the kind of like the content and so on, we jumped to the chance. And we had some ideas around kind of like different environments and different ecosystems, and that was a story that we had touched on in the TV series before in Planet Earth, actually. But actually, we thought we could tell in a different way through VR. And so we sort of started talking to some of our partners, and Preloaded was one of them. And because, as you say, we work with external development teams. And what these guys came back with, Phil and his team, just absolutely blew us away. I mean, it was the passion and the kind of the attention to detail and the clear sort of sort of willingness to really go for it, all guns blazing, just convinced us that this was
the right team.
Had no idea if it was going to be possible.
I know you told me. Yeah.
Well, Phil, maybe you can talk a little bit about your creative vision for the project.
Yeah, so I mean, I think when Bradley's talking about Daydream, one of the things that's really exciting about it is it's really, I would sort of almost consider it to be the most mainstream platform there is. And with Lenovo coming as well, with the 6 degrees of freedom, just the ability to be able to have a kind of high quality, immersive experience, just really kind of almost set the foundations for what we were trying to achieve, which was to build a piece of VR that was really going to reach a mainstream audience. And the thing about mainstream audiences is they're really, with VR, I mean, obviously gamers love VR because it's just like, puts you in there, it's super immersive. But for mainstream audiences, they're asking the question, like, actually, like, why is VR better than watching Blue Planet on 4K in my living room? So we worked really, really hard to try and understand, like, what could VR offer us as as a kind of platform that would sort of enhance the storytelling. If you think about natural history storytelling, really it's about, natural history filmmakers have always used new technology to tell new stories. So with this, we were trying to really identify, like, what are those new types of stories that we can tell with VR that you can't do in TV. We need to sort of justify its existence to a certain extent. So we looked at loads of different things, and actually if you play the experience, and you guys should come up and see it afterwards, there's lots of little kind of like plays with perspective, putting you in places which you could never film because it'd be too dangerous, showing things that are couldn't be visualized in real life. But really at the heart of the concept is a really big idea, which is about moving you from a passive observer to an active participant, and that is the kind of the crux of the experience, really putting you into a place where you feel like you're part of it and you're interacting. So like, at the beginning you meet an otter, and the ability to be able just to play with the otter and see the way it behaves with you and reacts to you is authentic, and that's something that you could never do in a TV series. So that's the vision, is like, how do we make this an active storytelling experience?
Well, that's the thing about VR, and I think we're going to look at games too, is like, what is this platform really good at, right? Yeah. Like, why this VR experience is good this way versus a linear show or AR. I'd like to talk to Kelly, if you can talk a little bit about the partnership
Yeah.
Like how that came together and like why was Google interested in content like this?
Well, we try and talk to anyone we think is making really cool stuff. BBC being definitely a top company in that genre. And I'm going to echo a bunch of things they said. I mean, as great partnerships tend to be, it was a real alignment from the get-go of like what we saw as an opportunity in VR on Daydream View, plus the Mirage Solo headset. And that is that one of the key offerings of VR being the ability to take you anywhere. And what I personally love to explore is that space, how the digital medium affords us that opportunity to not just take you to photorealistic environments, but what are the different ways we can represent these environments to get across additional meeting and learnings from that. Just as Phil was talking about, like the way you're interacting with the animals, those perspectives, some of the perspectives you saw in the trailer video, you can't get even from the BBC Earth, video footage that they capture. So it's very, I think, really takes into account the specific affordances of the medium, which is always exciting for us.
That's great. Well, since this is a BBC Earth project, and most of us are familiar with those landmark productions, this is very, very different that it's not filmed, right? And you've talked about the creative choices of why you chose to do that, which makes sense. But how do you deliver against audience expectations of realism? This is not what you think about when you think about BBC Earth. Bradley, can you speak to that at all?
Sure, yeah. I mean, what you will find is that the kind of like the science is real there, so it's not like we sort of just taken that as inspiration and then gone from there. We had sort of subject matter experts working on the project all the way through from our BBC Earth team, and so everything's been kind of like sort of ratified. We've gone into detail on kind of making sure that the behaviours of the animals are right, within the scope of kind of like the design and the kind of like the art style, that the kind of the way the creatures move is correct and so on.
And that meets the expectations of the audience.
Yeah, I think.
Expect that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but I think people get as well that this isn't supposed to be a perfect simulation from a kind of like a visual perspective. It's it is very true to life, but actually it's more about the kind of like the emotional experience, the experience that you're taken through as you go through the game. And it was actually interesting listening to the talk earlier about kind of Minecraft in education and how that really helps kind of kids to sort of be in the moment and kind of like experience something kind of like firsthand. And that's hopefully one of the things that comes across with this, is that if you're actually kind of living and not breathing, I guess, because you're underwater, but going through the experience, you're sort of that much closer to sort of understanding the kind of the science behind it.
We talked a lot about making it stylistic and authentic, but not realistic. So like everything is kind of imbued with a sort of a level of science and an understanding of this ecosystem. So from like the depths you dive to the way the otters are rigged, we had like sort of skeleton diagrams from Charlotte Jones, who was the natural history expert. The time of day, the direction of the beams of light going through, the depths you're going to, the relative reduction of color as you go deeper. All that stuff is authentic and something that we worked really, really hard to do, because I think we almost felt we had to work harder because it is stylistic. So actually it's really, and I think part of that idea of a sort of stylistic treatment allows us to, it kind of allows us to simplify the complexity of the world and draw focus on what's important. And in our business, we spend a lot of time trying to make complexity understandable and choosing where you need to put the focus to get kind of like key salient points across. So I think this is a sort of, the stylization really helps sort of like focus what you're getting out of it.
We did talk a lot about how baby otters move and how kelp moves in. Underwater.
Did you have real footage that you were working off of?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's a really interesting process, because if you go and film a documentary, you go out and you shoot hundreds of hours of footage, and you come back to the cutting room and you kind of cut it up, and then you piece together a story. For us, we had to start, there was no kind of shooting. It was really like, what's the story we want to tell? So actually, there was a lot of going back into kind of archive footage and looking at all of the work that BBC Earth have done and Blue Planet, and trying to find those segments and those bits that really allowed us to, envisage the best compositions. And then it was working back with the script and, finding the best story. I mean, the thing that's interesting about this, and I guess the difference between natural history, traditional natural history, is it's one continuous shot. So natural history, usually, there's a shot about a creature, and then there's another creature, and you just pull together the story. With this, you go from the surface all the way through. There's no breaks, and that was a key challenge for us, for sure.
I think what you're talking about is far as simplifying the world for the player also ties to a goal we've had with Daydream View and the Mirage Solo of accessibility across the platform and also the content and the interactions themselves, being very accessible and lowering that barrier to entry into it.
Because we want to target a mainstream audience. So, and actually, I guess the perception of that mainstream audience is that maybe they aren't gamers, so maybe they're not used to kind of like big open worlds. So trying to build an experience that people can just pick up and explore. And one of the things I feel so proud of is that when people go through the experience, most of them get all the way through to the end. And it's, that's navigating quite a large space. So trying to balance that open world with a kind of a clear, coherent kind of like path through, because that path is so important for the natural history story as well. Because when you think about natural history storytelling, it is that thread that weaves you from creature to location to creature. And if it was too open world, you'd just end up losing that coherent narrative. So there's a very, when you see it, if you guys see it, there's a very clear kind of design device that pulls you through, which is following the key creatures.
Was that a challenge for you, or was it different for you than approaching other kind of games or VR experiences?
Yeah, VR is just like totally different to anything we've ever done before. And I think what's funny about VR is you think you know what's going to work, and then you test it, and it just doesn't work at all. So we just did loads of prototyping.
I'd say that way of navigating through the world was something we iterated on a lot together, and bringing our own UX design team into it, because VR itself is so new, the 3DOF controller is new, and so everyone's understanding of it is still growing as we're developing these experiences.
And it's great because Google have like a bunch of guidelines that kind of are from all of your work, but actually you're also happy to sort of push those as well and like learn, and we were like learning on the program.
Yeah, that's always the balance is having some guidelines for developers, but then also recognizing that these aren't mandates by any means. We're all still figuring it out.
So I talked about this experience as real-time, right? I was wondering if, Kelly, if you could tell me a little bit more about what that means and what it's allowed you to do in this project?
A real-time experience? I don't understand the question as far as like versus
something about like how it allows an active experience.
Oh, sure, yeah, as opposed to a passive experience. Yes, absolutely. I'm a big fan of interactivity as a whole. I'm a person that learns by doing. So being able to take that content for a certain audience in a documentary or passive medium format may just wash over them. Having that engagement and finding that right balance to make it complex enough or feel open enough to keep the mind alert and engaged in the experience, but then also not making it too complicated or frustrating to allow people to get through the entire experience, I think increases the retention of the information that you're getting in the game.
And of course it's sorry. Yeah. Well, it's the world is real time, so everything has its own thing going on. The otters have got AI. So as you move through, we're trying to build this experience that can react to you. So one of the lovely things is like the otters are just basically diving continuously to sort of like get their urchins, and you can kind of like stumble upon little moments, and that real time nature feels like it's like you are in a real place, which is exactly obviously what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, one of the interesting things is actually we spent a lot of time on the kind of the pacing. Because one of the things you don't think about so much in VR is that, when you're kind of like, you're actively doing something and there's a voiceover as well, actually that's really difficult to take in kind of those two sort of things at the same time. And so we spend a lot of time and kind of like, the way that the kind of voiceover comes in at different kind of points, and that not to sort of overload the kind of the users too much. And I think, the end result sort of works, but it took quite a lot of gutting too.
Part of that, we were talking earlier about what how this is different to natural history documentaries, but actually one of the greatest compliments we have when people kind of take it off is like, if they're like, it feels like a landmark BBC experience. And I think that similarity to natural history documentaries is something that we aim for, because obviously we're doing something different, and actually when you're putting someone into a completely new experience, they need to kind of have things that feel familiar. And so like with the sort of the general kind of like, the sort of the narrative beats, the overall arc, the creatures and location storytelling, the kind of the big kind of like wise narration, the kind of big kind of orchestrated scores, all those things are kind of part of what I think people perceive BBC Earth and BBC Natural History documentaries to be about. So trying to kind of like find those bits was really important for us.
Well, that kind of speaks to the nature of expectations about BBC brand, right? There are those expectations. People feel a real relationship to BBC Earth.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, they've been watching this content for years, and this is the first immersive experience that they have, and the fact that you're able to pull that off and bring them on a journey, right, that they weren't expecting to have. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Lenovo headset, and I understand this is some launch content. And Callie, it's another question for you. What do you think it is about, what's special about that headset? And what can we, how is it going to change how people experience?
Yeah, well, so two key things. One is that it is an all-in-one device. So it's the Daydream View. You have to have a Daydream-ready phone to put into the headset, sort of a next level of the cardboard, that evolution. With the Mirage Solo, it's all complete in there, so you don't have to worry about having the right phone or that your friends have the right phone in order to share the experiences. And then the second thing is there's the 6 degrees of freedom on the headset without the need for outside trackers. So it's inside-out tracking, which is, fundamentally really great for just comfort. But I think you can imagine that it's also a huge boost to that sense of immersion into an environment.
Is it a different experience for Life in VR?
It is, yeah. We do. Funny enough, again, coming back to kelp. We
comes back to kelp.
You wouldn't believe
Yeah, when
how
you're
much
talking
time
about
we
California
spent
coast, that's
talking about
about it.
Yeah. Very important, to get the kelp right. We did do some features specifically for the Mirage. Yeah.
That's great.
I think what's interesting is that 3DOF is about, to make an immersive experience in 3DOF, you need to bring things close to you and have things sort of swimming past you because you can't get to them. So you need to bring the kind of world to you and actually put you into the action. Whereas with 6DOF, like moving into the action is kind of part of the fun. So trying to find that balance between the two is quite a tricky piece of kind of like choreography. But we've got it so when we've now got like if you move to the left, the squid will come to you. The Garibaldi like taps you in the face. The kelp moves around you. So there's lots of little kind of features we've added to it. I'm
curious, was it sequential? Did you work first on the Daydream project and then move over to Lenovo, or did you think about them at the same time in your development?
Well, we had, I'd say the Lenovo headset is fantastic, and we had some early kit from you guys. No, it's great. We were so happy to be working on that because for us it really feels like the progression for like mobile VR and certainly like where it should be going. So we had like some early kit, which was early.
Right, very early, yeah. So it was always a consideration in development. Like any developing process, the Daydream View was out, and so it was a good foundational tech to start from, and then evolve into the Mirage Solo is sort of how it happened over the course of development.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure there were a lot of challenges with a project of this scale, complexity. I'm sure everyone would love to hear, some of the down and dirty stuff about what you learned and, like what were some of the problems and did you overcome them all or the things you just had to let go of and move on?
It's one of my favorite subjects, actually. Yeah. Anyone that works in software development will know that there's always a certain amount of friction. It's just whether you can make that friction kind of healthy friction in terms of sort of the development process. So, on the one hand, you're kind of balancing, sort of project management aspects, so time, budget, and so on, with creative aspects. What do you want to achieve? What can you achieve? And then you've got technical aspects. What do you want to achieve through kind of performance? How can you kind of push the hardware and so on? And I think one of the things that actually did work really well is that there was a good amount of healthy kind of friction, in terms of kind of like, us having discussions about what we wanted to achieve, and, inevitably you're sort of saying, well, balancing one thing against another, and certain things have to go and certain things don't. But actually, I think that's what worked particularly well between the kind of three teams, was being able to have a kind of grown-up conversation about that as we went, if you like.
What about you, Phil? From a
Yeah, I mean, it was.
He's going to say something completely
I know
different.
he is.
No,
I know.
Those
He's
guys at
ready.
BBC.
He's ready.
I think the vision that we set out early on was really big, and I think we all bought into it. But I don't think we realised how difficult it was going to be to realise. I mean, we're talking the Daydream View and Lenovo are essentially just the power of a mobile phone. So to be able to do this level of kind of open world was very, very tricky. Coupled with that, there's a whole lot of user experience issues around how do you follow creatures, how do you avoid locomotion sickness. Then you've got the kind of authenticity piece. So we were starting kind of from the ground up, and I think I mean, credit to these guys because the first prototype we did was rough as hell, and then we moved into the vertical slice, which was definitely not where it should have been in terms of quality. So I think there was a lot of faith and confidence that we would get there, which was great for us because when you're in development and you can see the problems, but you need everyone else just to let you do it and let you fix it. So I think we were kind of a bit off our milestones early on, and that's, you sort of build a bit of debt up and you're trying to kind of get on top of it. But we managed to make it work, and then we got the Lenovo headset, and that was like a little bit maybe behind where it needed to be. And so it was very challenging, but it was good. You know, by the time we got to our like third milestone, I felt we all were in a good place, and then we had a little bit more time just to get the kelp working and get the models
kelp.
working.
Yeah,
Oh,
the
damn
kelp.
kelp. I mean, there's probably less kelp
There's
in
a
our
lot of
experience.
optimization
Yeah. There's less kelp than there probably really is in real life. But we've got a very short depth of field on the fog, so we've kind of like hide it. So lots of little tricks like that.
Well, I think Preloaded could do a really great talk on how to best under-promise and over-deliver, because I think that was always, I mean, he's saying that it wasn't exactly where he wanted it to be, but it was certainly on the, you know, we could all see that it was on the right trajectory. And and I mean, the second bit is with any interactive project, it's really all about trying to make the right choices about what to cut and what to lean into, and you're never quite positive until it's actually out there. And certainly it's been, 5.0 star rated title on Play Store, which is, if anyone's released something for free on Play, that's super hard to achieve. So I was glad to be validated in that way. That it seemed like we leaned into the right things.
So we were talking earlier, and Bradley, I've heard you talk about this project or describing it as a format.
Yeah.
Can you explain a bit more about like its features as a format, and like what does that mean, and where is it going to go from here?
Yeah. So I think you know, for us, part of kind of like what kind of makes a format is for VR is it's that level of immersiveness, but it's also the ability to kind of have interactivity. That's one of the kind of like the key elements. And so, if you think of when, you've got a TV series or you're doing something on the web or whatever, you basically, you don't fundamentally have that kind of like level of kind of immersiveness and that kind of, that hold over your kind of like your user for however many minutes it is. So for us, this kind of, as a kind of way of delivering natural history content in a way that hasn't been delivered before, I think that's what, to us, shows its potential to be a new kind of format, which I think is only going to get better in time as kind of, the hardware kind of improves and, there are better sort of control methods and the kind of, obviously, the performance improves. I think that will sort of make that even better.
So can I just add to that? So I think from a kind of design perspective, I sort of think about this, like the features that drop out of it. So there's a number of different things that feel like very format-like. So the way it kind of divides the different locations into chapters and the way you navigate through. So the idea is that whenever you get lost, you can just find your main creature and then hook back onto them and they'll take you through it. That feels like a nice sort of format piece. The way we use narration while you're on the creatures, but then we kind of like allow you to trigger your own. There's lots of little things like that. The way we've used sort of spatial audio in a particular way. Those feel like, to me, like defining features of this product and kind of almost make it a format.
And I think the discoverability, the discoverables as well. I think, this idea that, you can go through the experience, you can sort of come out the other end and realize that there are still things to kind of, to do again. And I think that kind of replayability, for sort of want of a better term, I think is, another thing that kind of, draws people back in to kind of replay.
Yeah, to replay, but then it's also offering more experiences than a standalone experience, right? I mean, BBC Earth is a franchise, right? Or I don't know if that's what you call it. You call it a franchise?
Yeah.
Okay, and so therefore there's an expectation there's going to be more, and this very much feels like a chapter or a beginning.
Maybe.
We all hope.
Yeah. We certainly have lots of ideas for future episodes, let's say. So yes, I know what you're hinting at from a format point of view. Might have multiple episodes in it.
Okay,
yes,
great.
That's what we hope.
Well, all right, let's broaden this out to a couple of more general questions, and for people out there who are working in VR and games, but also from a factual standpoint. I mean, this is Games for Change, and there's a lot of the subject matter that's addressed, whether it's a real-world issue or a historical issue. But talk about VR and what opportunities it presents for factual storytellers.
Well, I think I think like we've done here, we've allowed you to get closer to the subject matter and experience it in a different way. And I think people talk a lot about empathy and how VR can put you into a space and make you feel something because you're there, or put you into a place where you can see things from different people's perspective. And I think VR is just, I mean, for me, it's intoxicating. I just think of it as the most exciting sort of medium to ever work in. I'm so happy to be working in it right now because it just feels like the opportunities are so huge, and particularly, when we're trying to, I mean, I'm a big game player, but actually I think to be able to take you to places of historical significance or be able to put you in the sort of like the mindset or the perspective of different people is just so exciting. And I think I've never seen something as powerful as VR.
Do you think it's going to change, this experience is changing the direction of Preloaded, or are you guys going to?
Yeah, I mean, I think, just as, everyone who's a game studio is sort of like pivoting on the kind of immersive content piece, and I think we are just people who want to make cool experiences. The thing that's going to kind of unify everything we do is going to be play and purpose, and making sure that the stuff that comes out of the studio has a kind of like, at its heart, is playful and purposeful. And I think, we're like both feet into VR for sure.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
So this was created as a mainstream piece, not necessarily as an educational piece, just the way BBC Earth, as I understand it too. But there obviously are educational applications to this and using it in curriculum. Is there any thought or has been thought about how life in VR can be used in that context? And what do you see about the future of education in VR in general?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I think that you're right. We didn't set out to specifically make a piece of kind of education software here. I think, like our Landmark series, I think it helps to educate, and part of that is sort of putting you having that immersive experience. We have actually sort of talked about sort of ways in which we could take this as a starting point from a format point of view and sort of enrich it with kind of more educational content. So,
but I think it is. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you, but for me, this is like pure edutainment, for like want of a better word. It's like it's authentic, it's accurate. If you put a child or an adult into this, you'll get some educational value from it. And it's been amazing the last day having people. And actually just having so many people from schools come in over the last sort of yesterday, taking it off and saying, how can we get this in the classroom? And there's a real enthusiasm for this. And, I've got young kids who just absolutely adore it and just want to go and play with the otters all the time. And it's putting them in a place where they can't go, sort of democratizing, this type of experience and kind of getting people closer to it. I think it's incredibly powerful and relevant for education spaces.
So it is being offered for free. So their access budgetary issues from the educational point of view is not a barrier, right? Barrier is more about the hardware needed and accessibility there. I would imagine that's part of the plan or strategy of going from exclusively Daydream into the Lenovo Mirage. Has there been any, or can you see any formal relationships with schools to bring this in, or do you think it's just a matter of teachers on their own looking to find it and say, I'm going to find a way to bring this into my classroom?
Does it take more of the place of if a teacher were to show one of the series or episodes of the series, finding that right connection between the content and like the material or the material they're trying to cover in their course? It does feel like an extension of Expeditions, which is a tool set to also empower teachers to create their own tours, and Tour Creator, which allows anyone to create tours of anywhere you want. But what we've seen is a lot of people creating these like very localized and sometimes personal experiences to share. And so how can we, I mean, certainly that's, what Daydream, what we're thinking about as a whole is how can we create a platform to allow people to connect this content with the course or the interests of their classroom, communities, local networks.
I'm really interested in creating content that can exist in multiple places and implementations. So like, the idea that you could take something like Life in VR and break it into component parts, and you've got kind of like AR models that you can examine and kind of like see how otters are like, their bone structures, and then you've got a VR experience that's sort of like much more about an experiential piece, and you've got support content that kind of works with it, and thinking about how kind of all the different channels can be used for different means. I have huge empathy for schools and teachers who want and who experience things like this and say, my kids would love it, but it's so difficult to kind of commit to a particular platform right now. Things are moving so quickly, and it's really tough. And I mean, it's just a very fluid time right now. There's a lot of interest in it, but platforms are moving all the time.
We're going to continue that conversation tomorrow. There's a panel at the XR for Change Summit about VR and education.
Yeah.
It is in a lot of people's minds, and people are trying to figure it out, from the platform side, hardware side, to the content creators, and even within the districts themselves, wanting to bring this content in. So we only have a few more minutes, about 7-8 more minutes, but let's talk about the opportunity for VR to become mainstream and adopt, and for the mainstream to adopt it. What do you think we can do as storytellers, as developers, as funders even, to get to that point, right? Is there something that collectively we can do, or to drive that interest?
I think we are doing a lot of the right things, and I think it's sort of companies like sort of Preloaded and sort of other developers that are kind of pushing the bounds of sort of what's possible, and I think that draws in kind of a new audience. As we were talking about before, we wanted to make this as accessible as possible, and I think kind of for VR that there are barriers. In terms of kind of, especially from a kind of behavioural point of view, I think, people putting kind of headsets on and kind of, whether they're going to do that in public and so on. But I think kind of, as the market develops and it becomes kind of, more mainstream, there are more headsets out there, more content out there, I think that will really help to drive it. So it is a little bit of a kind of like, as it gains momentum, I think it needs to kind of get to that kind of critical mass. And I think, with all the new sort of hardware coming out, that will really help as well. I mean, you look at kind of, only 6 months ago, a year ago, the type of sort of kind of physical experience of sort of, big headsets with kind of like, lots of wires and so on. Some of those still exist, obviously. I think as things develop and you've got kind of like, a better experience, that will really help as well. And prices coming down, obviously.
We talk. Sorry, in the studio we talk a lot about low threshold design, and part of our business is really focused on like arts and culture and broadcast, and that audience is not a kind of typical games audience. So trying to like understand like what the expectation of audiences are, and basically meeting them there. And I think as developers we feel a huge sense of responsibility to make quality experiences that people take off the headset and go, wow, I'm totally in love with this medium. And actually there's some early VR and it still exists, will make people sick and will make people feel intimidated, and actually that's not what we need to do. We want to build something that is low threshold and is enjoyable, and there's a real responsibility, I think, for developers to make quality VR, because every time someone puts on a headset is a moment where we have the ability to be able to capture their imagination and make them love this medium, and because there aren't...
As opposed to nauseous.
Exactly.
Yeah, to that point, I think of it also as the cognitive load required by the player. I think we can see the possibilities of VR, especially in this mode of taking you anywhere, as a real powerful tool for empathy, to put you in the place of and experience the world in someone else's eyes. But there are challenges to to requiring that of someone when it's a hard experience. And right now, this is getting to your question of like, at this moment, how to sort of evangelize and continue to spread adoption of VR. I think it's a really important thing to think about, is like that cognitive load of like what you're requiring your player to think about and go through, and the situation that you're putting them in.
You're asking them to invest themselves.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
And what does that mean? What's the responsibility?
Yeah, and how do you convince them to put on that headset? It's a real barrier.
Phil, you've worked a little bit or you do a lot of work in location-based kind of experiences, right? Working in museums and things like that. When you think about building for that experience, the challenges, and then building for this experience, which is the opposite, right? Or do you see it as that?
Well, when you're designing VR to be installed, you need to really think about the visitor experience from kind of start to end and how that facilitation works. Certainly with this experience, sort of touring and doing festivals, we've built a kind of version that's much easier to facilitate. I think it's really, I mean, one of the great things about kind of building experiences that go into museums or galleries or public spaces is you have such a throughput of people, and just trying to design for that. So knowing like what you're trying to achieve with it is really important. I mean, the thing we just did recently at Tate in London was nine stations and 10 minutes. But it was finite. I think that's one of the key things about installed experiences is having a fixed time. Where this isn't fixed, you can be in there for like an hour, you can be in there for 5 minutes, and that's quite hard because you'll be walking over going, have you finished? Have you finished? And actually trying to get the throughput is very difficult. So yeah, I mean, they're definitely different experiences, but they focus on really trying to satisfy kind of audience need and expectation and what you're trying to get out of the experience, from a kind of.
Well, do you have anything else that you want to share? Because I want to do a little plug for you guys.
Plug away.
Yeah, I'm going to plug away. Well, first of all, if you haven't seen, up in the marketplace, we do have BBC Earth Life in VR at the end, one of the ends. I think there are 2 headsets.
3.
3.
Yeah.
So we can get a lot of
Right.
people through.
Yeah.
Please don't sit for an hour, but I guess you can if you want.
10 minutes. 10 minutes is what we're.
10 minutes is good. And you guys are going to be around for a couple more hours?
Yeah.
For sure.
To have a chat, but I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It's been wonderful to hearing the behind the stories and how this came together, and I do hope we get to see more.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you very much.